Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I am your host, Esther Adams, and today we are going somewhere a little different. We are going to talk about fear, not in a soft, motivational way, in a real, research backed, this is what is actually happening in your brain way. And we are going to connect all of it to online Western dressage showing because I think most people have never heard this conversation framed this way before. And once you hear it, I think it is going to change how you think about showing, about your horse, and about yourself. So let us start with something honest. There is a particular kind of rider I want to speak to today. She loves riding. She trains consistently. She has built something genuinely meaningful with her horse at home, something she is proud of, something that feels real and good when she is out in the arena on a quiet morning. And she still cannot quite bring herself to enter a show. She has her reasons. And underneath the reasons, whether she has named it yet or not, there is fear. And here is the thing about fear: it is not a character flaw, it is not weakness. It is a learning problem. And once you understand it as a learning problem, the whole conversation about showing and about online showing specifically becomes something entirely different. Let me explain what I mean. The brain has one job it takes more seriously than almost any other, and that is keeping you safe. When it encounters a situation that it has encoded as threatening, it activates what researchers call the fear-avoidance loop. Threat leads to fear. Fear leads to avoidance. And here's the part that makes this so persistent. Avoidance brings immediate relief. The anxiety drops. The body relaxes. And the brain records that as a success. Avoided equals survived. So the next time that situation comes up, whether it is a show entry form or the thought of a warm-up ring, the brain fires that same avoidance response faster and with more certainty than before. The loop tightens, and what sits on top of all of it, protecting it from examination, is a layer of perfectly reasonable sounding explanations that the brain generates to justify the avoidance without ever having to name the fear. Research calls these cognitive shields. They are socially acceptable narratives that allow avoidance to continue while keeping the underlying fear safely out of conscious examination. The fear does not need to announce itself. It just quietly keeps you out of the show pen, one perfectly reasonable explanation at a time. Now, here is what I find particularly interesting and particularly relevant to this conversation. There is a type of avoidance that researchers describe as a frozen goal. That is a situation where a person has stopped putting in effort towards something, but has not actually let go of the desire. The rider who still loves this discipline, still trains, still watches tests online, still thinks about competing someday, but has quietly stopped entering. Research on this pattern is clear and a little sobering. That state, that unresolved mental space of wanting something and consistently not moving toward it, is linked to higher psychological distress and lower life satisfaction over time. Not because the desire is harmful, but because the ongoing rumination of perpetual not yet accumulates a cost that most of us are not even aware we are paying. If that sounds familiar, I want you to keep listening. Now let us talk about what online Western dressage showing actually is, because I want everyone on the same page before we go deeper into the psychology. The Western Dressage Association of America maintains a list of recognized online shows, and I will put the link in the show notes. These are shows that have been approved through the Western Dressage Association of America, which means the scores you earn count toward national points programs. The judges at these shows are licensed through the United States Equestrian Federation. Many of them carry the Large R and Senior Large R designations, which are the highest and most experienced credentials available in the discipline. The evaluation you receive is as legitimate and as rigorous as anything you would receive at an in-person show. The only difference is how and where it happens. You record your test in your own arena with your own horse on a day when the work feels right, and you submit it. The judge evaluates it. You get real feedback on real work from a real professional, and your scores count. Some platforms worth knowing are dressageshowsonline.com, Spotlight, Johnson Dressage Online, Kensington Farm Online Horse Shows, and Thistle Run Equestrian Event. All of them offer Western Dressage Association of America rated classes. Each has its own character and entry process, so I would encourage you to explore a couple. Now, here is where I want to slow down and go somewhere most conversations about online showing never go. Because the reason online showing works for a lot of riders is not primarily about convenience. It is about something researchers call psychological safety. And I want to take a moment to explain what that actually means and why it matters so much for performance. Psychological safety is one of those terms that gets softened in everyday conversation into meaning something like being comfortable or feeling good about yourself. But in the research literature, it has a much more precise and important meaning. Psychological safety is the condition in which a person can engage fully with a challenging task without spending cognitive resources on self protection. Let me say that again in simpler terms. It is the state where your brain can put its full energy into what you are actually doing, rather than splitting that energy between the task and the threat of being negatively evaluated, watched, or compared to others around you. And here is why that matters so much for writing specifically. Research on complex motor tasks and writing a Western dressage test is very much a complex motor task, shows clearly that when a person perceives evaluative threat, the brain redirects cognitive resources away from the task itself and toward monitoring and self protection. Studies on stereotype threat, which is a form of evaluative threat where a person fears confirming a negative assumption about their group or themselves, found that it directly impaired dynamic balance in older adults, attributed to attention being split between anxious thoughts and the attention needed for maintaining balance. Another study found that gender-based stereotype threat during a motor learning task impaired both performance and learning across multiple conditions compared to a group where threat was removed. The mechanism is consistent across these studies. Threat consumes the attentional resources that skilled motor performance requires. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, documented shift in how the brain allocates its limited cognitive capacity. Now translate that to the traditional show environment. You are not just being evaluated, you are being evaluated continuously in real time in front of other riders who are also being evaluated in a space you have never been in before, on a horse who is reading everything your body is communicating. Every element of that environment is competing for cognitive resources that you need for the actual riding. And research is consistent that under high threat evaluative conditions, performance degrades, not because the skill has disappeared, but because the cognitive bandwidth required to access it has been rerouted elsewhere. This is not a character failing. This is the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do under threat conditions. The problem is that it is doing it in a context where you actually need it to do something else. Now, here is the important nuance, and I want to be precise about this because I think it is often misunderstood. The research does not say that removing evaluation removes the benefit. The research does not say you need a consequence free environment to perform well. What the research says is that threat reduction, reducing the specific conditions that divert cognitive resources towards self protection, allows better access to trained skills. The evaluation itself, a real judge, a real score, real written feedback, is not the threat. The continuous observation, the real time social comparison, the unfamiliar environment, those are the threat amplifiers. An online showing removes precisely those amplifiers while preserving the evaluation that makes the whole exercise meaningful. Let me make this even more concrete because I think this is one of the most important things I will say today. In your home arena, your brain is not managing novelty. It is not scanning for social threat. It is not splitting attention between the warm-up ring chaos and your horse's tension and the score sheet posted on the trailer 3 spaces down. Your cognitive resources are available for riding, for feel, for timing, for the conversation with your horse that Western Dressage is built on. And what the judge sees in that video is closer to the actual truth of your training than what you might produce in a traditional show environment where your nervous system is already managing too much before you ever enter the arena. And now I need to talk about the horse, because this is the thing that makes equestrian sport unlike almost any other performance discipline, and it is the piece that traditional discussions of show nerves almost always miss entirely. You are not performing alone. You are performing with a partner who is extraordinarily sensitive to your physiological state and responds to it in real time. Research on the relationship between horse and rider physiology has found that rider anxiety transfers to the horse through multiple measurable channels: muscle tension in the seat, legs, and hands, which the horse reads through contact; changes in breathing patterns; heart rate variability. The horse is reading you constantly, and when it detects a signal that something is wrong, it responds accordingly: shortened stride, elevated head carriage, tension through the top line, reluctance to move forward. Now the rider experiences that as difficulty or resistance, which confirms the nervous system's threat prediction, which escalates the rider's arousal further, which the horse mirrors back. It is a closed feedback loop, and the traditional show environment, with its unfamiliar barn smells, its charged warm up atmosphere, its accumulated environmental unpredictability, actively amplifies that loop before you ever pick up the reins for your test. Research on dyadic physiological synchrony, which is the study of how two bodies regulate each other's nervous systems, has found that when one partner is dysregulated, the other tends to mirror that dysregulation rather than buffer it, and that coupling tends to be tightest in ongoing, high stakes, highly monitored interactions, which is a very precise description of a traditional show warm up ring. Online showing in a familiar home environment breaks that cascade before it begins. Both you and your horse are in a regulated space. The horse is settled. You are not managing accumulated environmental threat. And the partnership that you have been quietly building at home can actually show up in the test rather than being overridden by mutual dysregulation. I also want to spend a moment on the warm up ring specifically because I think it deserves its own honest examination from a research perspective. Psychologists who study social comparison in competitive contexts have found that comparing yourself upward, meaning comparing yourself to someone who appears more skilled or successful, has very different effects depending on one factor: whether the gap between you and that person feels bridgeable. When the gap feels moderate and closable, upward comparison can actually motivate. But when the gap feels large, uncontrollable, or filtered through existing anxiety, research consistently finds that it produces disengagement, reduced participation, and avoidance rather than motivation. The warm up ring provides a continuous stream of upward comparison targets that you cannot opt out of and cannot control, and it delivers that stream at exactly the moment when your attentional resources are most critically needed elsewhere. Studies on social anxiety find that people with higher social anxiety engage in more frequent upward comparison, which then amplifies anxiety and promotes withdrawal rather than engagement. For the anxious rider, the warm up ring is not a neutral preparation environment. It is an anxiety amplifier that is running at full power at the worst possible moment. Online showing removes that comparison stream entirely. You ride your test in your arena. The judge evaluates your work against the standard of the movements, not against your position in a visible hierarchy of other competitors. Research consistently identifies this kind of evaluation against a standard rather than against visible others as the most conducive to genuine skill development and sustainable motivation over time. The competitive structure of online showing does not remove competition. It redirects it toward the only target that actually develops a horse and rider: the quality of the work itself. Now, let me talk about what happens when a feared experience actually goes well, because this is where the real recalibration begins. The research on exposure based approaches to fear tells us something very specific. The intensity of the fear you feel during an exposure, meaning a direct encounter with the feared situation, is not the variable that determines whether your fear updates. What determines whether fear updates is whether the predicted disaster actually occurs. Your brain holds what researchers call a threat expectancy, a prediction that something bad is going to happen. That prediction updates when you encounter the feared situation and the disaster does not follow. A large clinical study examining over 8,000 exposure exercises across hundreds of patients found that the learning rate, how effectively each safe experience is encoded and integrated by the brain, predicted long term fear reduction far better than how frightened the person felt during any individual session. What this means for showing is significant. Forcing yourself into a maximally frightening competitive environment when your nervous system is already flooded with threat predictions is not the optimal path to reducing fear. If performance degrades under those conditions, which the research suggests it reliably will when threat is high, you have just confirmed the feared outcome. The exposure strengthened the fear rather than reducing it. What the brain needs in order to update the threat prediction is not maximum intensity. It is a genuine encounter with the feared context, specifically evaluation by a credentialed professional in conditions where the nervous system stays regulated enough to let the trained skills actually show up and where the outcome is survivable and real. That is what online showing provides. The evaluation is real, the judge has credentials, the score counts, but the threat amplifiers that reliably prevent that corrective experience from occurring have been removed. And each time that corrective experience happens, something shifts. The threat prediction becomes slightly less certain, the fear becomes slightly more manageable, the loop begins to loosen rather than tighten. Research is honest that this is not a one time event. Fear does not vanish after a single test. The original threat memory does not get erased. What builds over repeated corrective experiences is a competing network of safety memories that gradually comes to outweigh the threat memories. One test at a time, the brain accumulates evidence that this situation, evaluated riding in a Western dressage context, is something it can handle. And eventually, that evidence changes how the context feels. Now, let me talk about community, because it is the piece that most conversations about online showing leave out entirely. And the research suggests it may be just as important as everything else we have discussed. Studies on online communities and communities of practice are consistent on this point. A genuine felt sense of belonging, to peers, to shared goals, to visible recognition structures, is one of the strongest predictors of continued participation and one of the most powerful buffers against fear driven withdrawal. You need somewhere to belong while you are doing the thing that still feels a little scary. And that somewhere needs to be genuinely welcoming in structure, not just in spirit. Western Dressage has regional clubs and associations in almost every state in America. These organizations build on top of the national structure offered by the Western Dressage Association of America and offer their own award programs, their own community, their own year-end recognition. And here is something that surprises a lot of people. You can join most of them regardless of where you live. You do not have to be a resident of that state. Exploring the regional clubs and associations that exist across the country is one of the most underutilized pathways in this community, and I genuinely encourage you to look into what is available beyond just the national organization. One regional club that stands out particularly for newer and returning riders is the Western Dressage Association of Massachusetts. I want to be very clear again. You do not need to live in Massachusetts to join. Membership is open to anyone, anywhere in the world. Everything they offer, including their year-end awards ceremony, exists online. A rider in rural Montana, in Texas, in Canada, anywhere, can be as fully part of this community as anyone in New England. The Western Dressage Association of Massachusetts has a medal program that moves through bronze, silver, and gold levels. The bronze is built specifically around intro and basic levels, and this detail matters. Intro and basic are the only levels under Western Dressage Association of America guidelines where a smaller, non standard arena court is permitted. That makes the bronze pathway accessible to a huge number of riders working at home without a full size dressage court. To earn the bronze, you submit 2 scores at intro level and 4 at basic level, or 6 from basic alone, all at 65% or higher, with at least 1 score from the highest test in the level from 3 different United States Equestrian Federation licensed Western dressage judges across 3 separate recognized shows. When you earn all 3 medals, bronze through gold, you become eligible for a custom Western Dressage Association of America belt buckle. What makes the Western Dressage Association of Massachusetts particularly accessible for riders showing online is their policy of accepting scores from any Western Dressage Association of America recognized show. Some regional clubs restrict medal submissions to specific shows only. The Western Dressage Association of Massachusetts does not. If the show is recognized by the Western Dressage Association of America, the score counts toward your medal. For a rider building their competitive record entirely through virtual platforms, that flexibility is not a small thing. They also offer a Rookie of the Year program that I think is one of the most thoughtfully designed programs in the community because it is built not on performance scores, but on participation. It is for riders in their first or second year of membership. Credits are earned for attending clinics, submitting virtual tests, entering schooling shows, and auditing. Virtual and in person activities carry equal weight. At the end of the year, the rider with the most credits wins a custom jacket. Research on communities of practice is consistent that newcomers who receive early recognition tend to remain active considerably longer than those who enter quietly and go unacknowledged. What this program is doing in research terms is providing what is called early mastery recognition, an explicit signal that participation itself has value before performance reaches any particular standard. That matters psychologically more than most people realize. The year-end awards program runs from January through mid-December, requires 5 tests from at least 3 shows and 2 separate judges, and counts virtual and in-person shows equally. The ceremony is held online. A rider anywhere in the world can log in, watch their name called, and feel in the most concrete sense that they are part of something that extends beyond their own fence line. Research on belonging in distributed communities consistently finds that visible recognition rituals are among the most powerful signals of genuine inclusion available to geographically dispersed members. That ceremony is a psychological event, not just a logistical solution to geography. I also want to mention the Western Dressage Association of America's national recognition programs because they work in concert with everything we have discussed. The year-end High Point program is free to enroll in. No registration fee, no hidden cost whatsoever. You enroll, accumulate scores from Western Dressage Association of America recognized shows throughout the year, and top performers in each division become eligible for a genuine belt buckle at the end of the year. That belt buckle is not incidental. Research on reward and motivation tells us that tangible, symbol-laden recognition objects do something important at the psychological level. They reinforce identity. The rider who earns a buckle through a year of consistent work is not just receiving an award. She is receiving an object that says, in the clearest possible terms, I am someone who competes. I showed up. I did the work. This is evidence of that. The Western Heritage Lifetime Performance Awards program takes an even longer view, tracking a horse's performance across an entire competitive lifetime, which is a genuinely beautiful structure when you think about what the Western Dressage Association of America has always been about: honoring the horse, valuing the partnership, and celebrating the journey rather than any single moment in it. Before I close, I want to spend a moment on something that I think is the most under-acknowledged dimension of what we have been talking about today, and that is identity. For the rider who has stepped away from competition, whether after a fall, after an injury, after years of life pulling attention elsewhere, the barrier to return is not only fear of what might happen in the future. It is something more disorienting than that. It is not knowing whether the rider who used to compete still exists. Researchers who study identity after setback in athletic contexts describe this as a liminal phase, an in between state where the old identity is not fully present and a new one has not yet formed. And returning to traditional competition in that state requires doing something that is psychologically quite demanding, publicly claiming an identity that has not yet been privately rebuilt. You show up at the venue as a competitor before you have accumulated the internal evidence that you still are one. And if the performance goes badly under the conditions that, as we have discussed at length today, tend to make performance worse for anxious riders, that identity claim feels premature rather than confirmed. Online showing reverses that sequence. You rebuild the identity privately, test by test, in a context where the experience is real, but the exposure is on your terms. Each score from a credentialed judge is a piece of external evidence that the identity you are reconstructing has actual content. Each medal is not just a competitive achievement. It is, in the most precise psychological sense, an identity document, a record of who you are becoming in this discipline, accumulated before that identity needs to be presented to anyone else. Research on safe, progressive mastery contexts consistently finds that this is how identity actually gets rebuilt after setback, not through a single dramatic return to the arena, through the quiet accumulation of evidence that the person you used to be is still there, still learning, still capable of doing something difficult and beautiful with a horse. So here's what I want you to take away from today. Online Western dressage showing is not a lesser version of competition. It is not a consolation pathway for riders who cannot handle real showing. It is a structure that removes the specific conditions that make fear worse while preserving the specific conditions that make improvement possible. The evaluation is real, the judges are credentialed, the scores count, the community is genuine, and the feedback loop between a good test, a real score, and a nervous system learning that this situation is manageable, that is the most powerful fear recalibration tool available to a rider who has been standing at the edge of competition, not quite able to step in. Start with the Western Dressage Association of America recognized show list in the show notes. Enroll in the year-end High Point program because it costs nothing and your scores start building towards something from the very first test. Look into the Western Dressage Association of Massachusetts and explore the regional clubs and associations across the country because the community, the Rookie of the Year program, the bronze medal pathway, and the online ceremony mean you are not doing this alone. Pick a platform, ride your test on a morning that feels right, and submit it. The brain that has learned with terrifying efficiency that avoidance works can also learn, with the right structure around it, that approach works better. And that structure is here, waiting for you to use it. Thank you for spending this time with me on Strides to Solutions. I am Esther Adams. I will see you in the next episode.